The morning Silas Colter found a woman sleeping in his hayloft. The sun had barely cracked the ridge of the Absaroka Mountains, and his whole quiet life cracked open right along with it. He had risen before dawn the way he always did, the same way he had risen every morning for the past 11 years since he had built this homestead with his own 2 hands on the eastern slope of the Wyoming territory. The year was 1878, and the world beyond his mountain felt like it was spinning faster than any man could keep up with. But up here, among the pines and the cold creek water and the smell of wood smoke, things moved at a pace that suited Silas Colter just fine. He was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders in a way that made doorframes feel narrow, with dark hair that curled past his collar because he only bothered cutting it when it started getting into his eyes. His jaw was always carrying a few days of dark stubble, and his hands were the kind of hands that had split wood and tanned hides and pulled river fish and built walls without anyone else's help. He was not a man who needed much from the world. He had his 2 mules, his 3 horses, his chickens, his garden plot, his traps, and his solitude, and for 11 years that had been more than enough. He pulled on his boots at the edge of his bunk, laced them with the methodical patience of a man who had learned that haste was usually the beginning of trouble, and then he threw his coat over his shoulders and stepped out into the cold blue air of early September. The mountains in September had a particular kind of beauty that never got old. The aspens were just beginning to turn, their leaves going gold at the edges like something lit from inside, and the air smelled of pine resin and coming frost. Silas pulled in a long breath and let it out slow, watching it cloud in front of him, and then he crossed the yard toward the barn to check on his mare, Pearl, who had been favoring her left foreleg for 3 days running. He pushed open the barn door, and the warm smell of hay and animals met him, and he was already thinking about Pearl's leg, already running through what he might need to do for her when he heard it. A small sound. A soft, almost imperceptible sound that did not belong to any of his animals. He stopped walking. He stood very still the way a man who has spent years reading the wilderness learns to stand still, every sense going quiet and sharp at once, and he listened. There it was again, a slow, even breath, the kind of breathing that meant sleep. Silas looked up at the hayloft. The ladder leading up to it was rickety but sturdy enough, and he climbed it without making a sound, which for a man of his size and weight was no small thing. He moved quietly out of long habit, and when his eyes cleared the edge of the loft floor, he saw her. She was lying curled on her side in the loose hay, her knees drawn up toward her chest, one arm tucked beneath her cheek like a pillow. She was young, somewhere in her mid-20s by the look of her, with dark auburn hair that had come loose from whatever arrangement it had been in and now spread out around her in the hay like spilled copper. Her dress was blue calico, faded at the elbows, and it was torn at the hem and muddy at the boots, which told him she had been walking some distance and through rough country. There was a small cloth bag near her feet that looked nearly flat, as though whatever had been in it had long since been used up or lost. Her face, even in sleep, had a kind of tension in it, the tension of someone who had been frightened or desperate recently, and whose body had not yet gotten the message that it was allowed to rest. Silas looked at her for a long moment. He was not a man who made fast decisions based on impulse, but he was also not a man who needed much time when a situation was plain. This situation was plain. A woman, alone, had walked through the Wyoming wilderness until she found a barn and crawled into his hayloft and fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion. Whatever had brought her to that point, she was not a threat to him. She was in need of rest and food and a safe place to catch her breath, and those were things he could provide without her having to explain herself to him before she was ready. He climbed back down the ladder as quietly as he had climbed up, and he went to work. He checked Pearl's leg first because the mare needed him and could not wait, and he found the swelling had gone down some overnight, which was a good sign. He packed the leg in a poultice of his own making and wrapped it fresh and told Pearl in a low voice that she was doing well, and Pearl turned her soft dark eye toward him and blew warm breath against his cheek. Then he fed the other horses and the mules and scattered grain for the chickens and checked the water trough, all of it done with the quiet efficiency of a man who had performed these tasks so many times that his body could do them while his mind was somewhere else. His mind was in the hayloft. He went back to the cabin and built the fire up from the coals and put coffee on, and then he started breakfast. He made it like he was cooking for company, which he almost never did. He fried thick slices of salted pork in the iron skillet until they were crisp and fragrant, and then he poured off most of the fat and scrambled 4 eggs in what remained, seasoning them with a pinch of dried sage from the bunch that hung above the stove. He cut thick slices of the sourdough bread he had baked 2 days ago and toasted them against the hot iron, and he put a small jar of his neighbor Agatha Pendleton's wild plum preserves on the tray, because it was the only sweet thing he had in the cabin, and he had a feeling that whoever was sleeping in his hayloft could use something sweet. He poured coffee into a tin mug, added a generous amount of sugar because she might have been traveling hard and her body would want it, and he put all of it on a flat board that served him well enough as a tray. He carried it to the barn and climbed the loft ladder one-handed, which required some considerable balance and arm strength, and he set the board down gently at the edge of the loft without making a sound. Then he put a wool blanket he had grabbed from the cabin beside it, because the morning was cold and the hay was not warm enough, and then he climbed back down and went about his day. He was at the woodpile when he heard her. Not words, not yet, just the sound of movement from inside the barn, and then a long silence, and then more movement. He kept splitting wood. The axe came down with a clean crack on each log, and he stacked the split pieces in the growing pile, and he did not look toward the barn door. He gave her time. She appeared in the barn doorway about 20 minutes after he had heard her first stir. She stood in the wide doorframe with the morning light behind her and the tray in her hands, the blanket around her shoulders, the tin mug still steaming, and she looked at him the way a wild creature looks at something it cannot quite decide whether to run from. He set the axe down and straightened up, and he could see her eyes go wide at the size of him, which was something he had gotten used to. He was not a small man by any measure, and in his work coat with the axe in his hand he probably looked like something out of a tall tale. He kept his hands open and his expression easy, the way he did when he was trying not to spook a nervous horse. "Morning," he said, just that, nothing else. She swallowed. Her eyes were green, he noticed, a deep and complicated green like creek water over dark stone, and they were doing a very thorough job of reading him. "I owe you an explanation," she said. Her voice was low and a little rough from sleep, but underneath that roughness was something precise and careful in the way she formed her words. She had some education, or at least she had grown up somewhere that valued clear speech. "No, you do not," he said. He picked up the axe and set it against the woodpile out of her sightline because he thought it might make her more comfortable. "You owe me nothing. Coffee any good?" She blinked. She looked down at the mug in her hands as if she had forgotten she was holding it. "It is very good," she said slowly, and something in her face changed, some small thawing of the tension he had seen even while she slept. "I am sorry I used your barn without permission." "Barn is there for shelter," he said. "That is what it is for." She studied him a moment longer. Then she came out of the doorway and sat down on the chopping block he was not currently using, which happened to be the only sitting surface in the yard besides the porch steps, and she held the coffee in both hands and drank it, and she looked out at the mountains, and the color came back into her face slowly, like a fire catching. "My name is Ella," she said finally. "Ella Talbot. Silas Colter," he said. He went back to splitting wood because it was work that needed doing, and because he thought she might talk more easily if he was not just standing there watching her. He was right. "I came from Cody," she said. "Before that Cheyenne. Before that back east, but it does not seem worth counting that far." He split a log without comment, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that invited more words rather than demanding them. "I was traveling with my uncle," she said. "He had business in Cody. I had nowhere else to be after my father passed, and my uncle was the only family I had, so I went with him." She stopped. He heard her drink the coffee again. "He died on the road 3 weeks ago. Fever. I buried him myself with a shovel I borrowed from a rancher, and I have been trying to get to the closest town ever since, but I took a wrong turn somewhere near the northern fork of the Shoshone River, and I have been lost for 2 days." Silas set the axe down. "You have been walking in the mountains alone for 2 days." "More or less," she said. "I found your barn last night about 2 hours after dark." The horses inside were very calm, which I took as a good sign. She paused. "I did not know whose property it was. I was going to leave before anyone woke up." "But you did not." "I was more tired than I thought," she said, and there was a wryness in her voice that he found he liked. A woman who could be wry about her own situation after what she had just been through was a woman with some backbone. He looked at her properly then, taking in the torn hem and the muddy boots and the depleted bag, and the proud way she was sitting on that chopping block despite all of it. She had finished the eggs and most of the pork and 2 of the bread slices, he noticed, and she was not apologetic about her appetite, which was also something he respected. "There is no town close enough that you could walk to it," he said. "The nearest is Harlow Creek, which is 18 miles east down the mountain. The trail is rough." "I have been walking rough trails for 2 days," she said. "You have," he agreed, "but not with a sprained ankle." Her eyes dropped to her left boot and she was quiet for a moment. "You noticed that. You favored it when you walked from the barn. It is not bad. Probably happened yesterday and you walked on it anyway." She was quiet again. He could see her thinking, working through her options the way a practical person does when the options are limited. "Is there a horse you could spare?" she asked. "I have no money to pay you, but I could work for the loan of it. I can cook. I can clean. I can garden if you have one." "I have a garden," he said. "Then I can garden and cook and clean until I have earned the horse, and then I will ride to Harlow Creek and find some kind of work and send the horse back to you." He looked at her for a long time. She met his gaze without flinching, which he noticed. "Pearl is the gentlest," he said, "but she is recovering from a leg injury and cannot be ridden for at least 2 weeks. You cannot ride any of the other horses because they are working horses that do not take to strangers easily." 2 weeks, she repeated. 2 weeks. She nodded slowly, as if she were making a deal with herself. "Then I will stay 2 weeks and work, and when Pearl is healed I will ride to Harlow Creek." "That is a fair arrangement," he said, and he meant it, though the arrangement was not why he was agreeing. He was agreeing because she had been walking alone in the Wyoming mountains for 2 days with a sprained ankle after burying her uncle with a borrowed shovel, and he was not the kind of man who could look at that situation and say, "Not my problem." He also was not the kind of man who could examine too closely why the idea of her leaving in 2 weeks sat in his chest like a stone he had not expected to find there. The first thing she did, once she had finished breakfast and rested her ankle for a while on the porch with her boot off and the cool morning air on it, was take a look at his garden and make a sound that was somewhere between dismay and determination. "You have let the squash vine go too far," she said, crouching at the edge of the plot in her stocking feet with the blanket still around her shoulders. "And those bean plants are getting choked by this weed here. What is your name for this weed?" "I call it trouble," he said. She looked up at him and almost smiled, and the almost was enough to do something strange to his pulse. "I call it lamb's quarter," she said. "You can eat it if you are desperate, but it is robbing your beans. We should pull it." He said. "I said I would garden," she reminded him, and she was already pulling up the weed with her bare hands, her auburn hair falling forward over her face. He found her a pair of old work gloves that were far too large for her, and she put them on without complaint and kept pulling weeds, and he worked alongside her in the garden for 2 hours, and they talked, and they did not talk, and both the talking and the silence felt natural in a way that Silas was not entirely prepared for. Her father had been a school teacher in Cincinnati, Ohio. She had grown up with books, which explained the preciseness of her speech. Her mother had died when Ella was 12 of pneumonia, and after that it had been just Ella and her father, who had been a gentle and impractical man with a great love of literature and a poor head for money. When he died 18 months ago, he had left Ella with very little besides the books, and she had tried to make her way working as a seamstress, but the work was thin and the pay was thinner. And when her Uncle George had come through Cincinnati saying he had business opportunities in Wyoming and offering to take her along, she had said yes because there was nothing left in Cincinnati to say no for. "Do you regret it?" Silas asked. He was pulling a stubborn weed that had wound itself around the base of a squash vine, working it loose from the earth with careful fingers. Ella considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I regret that George died," she said. "He was not a bad man. He was a foolish man, which is a different thing. He thought Wyoming would be easier than it turned out to be." She paused. "I do not regret leaving Ohio. There was nothing there for me. Whatever is here, at least it is not nothing." "That is one way to look at Wyoming," he said. "What is your way?" she asked. He looked out at the mountains, the way the morning light was working its way down the slope and turning the aspens from gray-green to bright gold. "It is the only place I have ever been that is exactly as large as it feels," he said. "In most places, the world turns out to be smaller than you expected. Here it is always bigger." She followed his gaze to the mountains, and he saw something in her face go soft and open. "Yes," she said, "I can see that." By the end of the first week, there was a rhythm to things that felt less like a temporary arrangement and more like something that had always been there. Ella cooked breakfast every morning while Silas did the barn work, and the cabin smelled different with someone else in it. Smelled like whatever she added to the eggs or the biscuits, or the occasional pot of soup she made from the dried beans and the last of the summer vegetables. She had organized his spice shelf on the second day, rearranging the small jars he had collected from the trading post in Harlow Creek into an order that made more sense than his original arrangement. And she had asked his permission before doing it, which he had given, and she had thanked him. And the whole exchange had been so politely and carefully done that it had made him feel something he had no immediate name for. She slept in the cabin. He had offered her his bunk on the first night, and had moved his own sleeping to the loft, building a proper bed up there with a corn husk mattress from the supplies in the tack room. She had protested this for about 10 minutes and then accepted it because the ankle was still swollen, and climbing a loft ladder every night was not sensible, and Ella Talbot was, at her core, a sensible woman. He told her about the mountains. He told her where the berry patches were, and how to read the weather by the shape of the clouds over the western peaks, and what the calls of the different birds meant when you were trying to figure out where game was moving. She listened to all of it with complete attention, the way a person listens when they are taking real notes, and she asked smart questions that showed she had been paying close attention to the world around her even when it was unfamiliar. She asked why the aspens grew in clusters rather than alone, and he explained that they shared root systems, that what looked like a grove of separate trees was often a single organism connected underground, and she had gone very still and looked at the aspens on the hill above the cabin for a long time after that. "That is the most extraordinary thing I have ever heard," she said. "Most of the best things in Wyoming are things you cannot see from a distance," he said. "You have to get close." She had turned to look at him then, and the green of her eyes in the afternoon light was something he was going to have difficulty forgetting, and he knew it. He looked away first. On the 8th day, she found the box of books on the high shelf in the corner of the cabin. He had not mentioned them because they had always been a private thing, the one softness in his otherwise thoroughly practical home. He had carried them on his back up the mountain when he had first come here, a collection of 12 volumes wrapped in oilskin that included a battered copy of Moby Dick, both volumes of George Eliot's Middlemarch, a field guide to North American birds, a book of geology, 2 volumes of Shakespeare, a collection of poetry, and 4 others in various states of wear. He had read each of them so many times that certain passages had arranged themselves permanently in his memory. Ella stood on her toes to pull out Middlemark and held it with both hands and looked at it the way some people look at old friends they were not expecting to find so far from home. "You have read this," she said, and it was not entirely a question. "Twice," he said. She turned it over and looked at the spine. "My father had a copy," she said. "I read it 4 times. The 5th time I started it, I could not finish it because he died before I got to the end and it felt wrong to finish it without him." "Dorothea Brooke," he said. "Dorothea Brooke," she agreed, and the look she gave him over the top of the book was the kind of look that rewrites something in you, that says, "Oh, you are more than I expected, and I was not expecting nothing. May I borrow it while I am here?" "You may," he said, and then, because he was not a man who knew how to leave well enough alone when something inside him wanted to reach further, he said, "I could read it with you if you wanted, in the evenings." He expected her to decline politely. She did not. "I would like that very much," she said, and she was already opening the book. They read together in the evenings after supper, sitting at opposite ends of the table with the oil lamp between them, passing the volume back and forth, reading aloud to each other in turns. Silas had a deep, slow reading voice that surprised her the first time she heard it, that matched so well the landscape outside that she told him he sounded like the mountains talking, and he had not known what to say to that, so he had said nothing, and just felt the warmth of it settle into him. She had a good reading voice too, precise and expressive, with pauses in exactly the right places. Her father, the schoolteacher, had given her that. On the evenings they did not read. They sat on the porch and watched the stars come out, and Silas pointed out the constellations and told her what the trappers called them, and what the Shoshone people called them, because he had spent time with the Shoshone when he had first come to Wyoming, and had learned things from them that he had never forgotten. Ella listened to all of it with the same focused attention she gave everything, and she asked questions about the Shoshone, about their way of life and their knowledge of the land, and he answered honestly, including the parts about how badly the government and the settlers were treating them, and she did not look away from those parts or try to make them easier. She just took them in with the same clear-eyed honesty she brought to everything. "My father used to say that the measure of a person's character is what they do with knowledge they find uncomfortable," she said one evening, watching the stars. "Most people put it away in a drawer and forget about it. A few do something with it." "What do you do with it?" he asked. "I try to remember it," she said. "I try not to look away." She was quiet for a moment. "What do you do with it?" "I try to live so it does not get worse," he said. "I do not know if that is enough." "I do not know either," she said, "but it is something." He looked at her profile in the dark, the shape of her face against the star-scattered sky, and he thought that she was the most fully present person he had ever met. Most people were somewhere else most of the time, thinking about where they were going or where they had been. Ella Talbot was here, in the specific moment she was in, with all of herself in it. It was the rarest thing he had encountered in 31 years of paying attention to the world. Pearl's leg was healing well. He could see the swelling going down a little more each day, and the mare was putting weight on it fully now, walking without the hitch she had had a week ago. Another week, maybe less, and she would be ready to ride. Silas noted this with the careful precision he applied to everything about the homestead, and tried not to note the way the thought of Pearl being healed made something in his chest go quiet and hollow. Ella noticed things about him too. He understood this gradually, the way you come to understand something that has been true for a while but that you have only just started seeing. She noticed that he did not eat until everyone else, meaning the animals, had been fed and cared for. She noticed that when he was thinking hard about something, he went to the woodpile, not because wood always needed splitting, but because his hands needed occupation. She noticed that he had a particular way of listening that was different from the way most people listened, which was to say he actually listened, with his whole body oriented toward the speaker and his eyes fully present, not planning his response while the other person was still talking. "You are a very good listener," she told him on the 9th day. She was at the stove, stirring a pot of soup that smelled like something from a much larger and better-equipped kitchen than his, because she had a gift for making more out of less. Most people are only waiting for their turn to speak. Listening is how you learn things, he said. He was at the table sharpening a knife with long, even strokes of the whetstone. You cannot listen and talk at the same time. No, she agreed. You cannot. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, without looking at him, I think I have been talking too much, since I have been here. I think the loneliness of the past few weeks has backed up in me, and it is all coming out at once, and I apologize if it has been overwhelming. He set the whetstone down. I have been living alone for 11 years, he said. I had forgotten what it is to have someone to talk with. I have not found it overwhelming. I have found it. He stopped. He was not a man who always had easy access to the right words, but he meant to finish the sentence, so he waited until he found them. I have found it a gift, he said, if you want the honest answer. She turned from the stove then, and she looked at him, and her eyes were doing that thing they did sometimes where all the layers of her were present in them at once. That is the honest answer, she said. Thank you for giving it. He went back to the knife and the whetstone, and the fire crackled and the soup simmered and the wind moved through the pines outside, and the silence between them was the warmest thing in the room. On the 11th day, there was trouble. It came in the form of 2 men on horseback who appeared at the edge of his property around midday, while Silas was on the far side of the barn mending a fence, and Ella was hanging washing on the line he had strung between 2 pines near the cabin. He heard them before he saw them, the particular quality of horses ridden by men who did not care how much noise they made, and he came around the barn corner with his hammer in his hand and looked at them. They were rough men. He had seen enough rough men in Wyoming to recognize the kind quickly. There was a looseness about them, a quality of not quite occupying their own horses properly, and they had the look of men who had been riding hard for a few days and eating poorly, and who were consequently in a mood that made them unpredictable. One of them was big and red-faced with a beard that had gone patchy, and the other was lean and younger, maybe 22 or 23, with quick eyes that moved over everything, including Ella at the washing line. The young one's eyes stayed on Ella. Silas walked forward unhurried and positioned himself between the 2 horsemen and the washing line without making it look deliberate. It was deliberate. Afternoon, he said. Looking for a woman, the red-faced one said. He had a flat, nasal voice. Traveling with a wagon, lost her near the North Fork of the Shoshone about 2 weeks back. You seen anyone come through? Silas kept his expression easy. What is your business with her? He asked. The red-faced man shifted in his saddle. Family matter. Is she your family? Kin of a friend of mine. That was 3 layers of vagueness on a simple question, which told Silas everything he needed to know about the truth of the matter. He glanced at Ella without appearing to, the way a man looks without seeming to look, and he saw that she had gone very still at the washing line, her hand stopped on a shirt she had been pinning, and her face had gone pale. He knew these were not men looking for a missing relative out of concern. Have not seen any wagon, he said, which was true. Have not seen any woman traveling alone. That part was not entirely true, but it was true enough for the purposes of the conversation. You might try south of the river. Trail comes through a canyon that way, and a lot of travelers miss the northern fork entirely. The red-faced man chewed on something and looked past Silas toward the cabin. What is that washing on the line? Mine, Silas said, in a tone that did not invite further examination of the claim. The lean young one's quick eyes came back from Ella's direction and found Silas's face, and whatever he saw in Silas's face made him recalibrate. Silas was aware that he was a large man. He was aware that he was holding a 16-ounce hammer and standing in a way that suggested he had no intention of moving, and that his expression, which had not changed since they arrived, was the kind of expression that large, quiet, unafraid men used to communicate that the cost of pushing further would be higher than the potential gain. The young one touched the older one's arm and said something low. The older one's jaw worked. He looked at Silas for another 5 seconds, which Silas received without blinking, and then he pulled his horse's head around. "South of the river," he repeated, like he was committing it to memory. "That is what I said," Silas confirmed. They rode away. He watched them go until they were fully out of sight down the western trail and he could no longer hear the horses, and then he turned and walked to the washing line. Ella had set the shirt she was holding down into the wash basket, and she was standing with her arms wrapped around herself, looking at the place where the men had disappeared. Her face was still pale. She looked at him when he came close, and there was something in her eyes that was not quite fear and not quite anger, but somewhere between the two. "You know those men?" he asked. She nodded once. "The older one is called Reed Harkin. He ran a supply business out of Cody. My Uncle George owed him money, for goods George took on credit and never paid for because George was, as I said, a foolish man." She stopped and steadied herself. "When George died, Harkin decided the debt transferred to me. It does not, legally speaking, but Harkin does not operate by legal speaking. He tried to collect the debt in his own way in Cody, and I ran. That is the full truth of why I am walking lost in the Wyoming mountains instead of arriving in Harlow Creek on a wagon with my uncle." Silas absorbed this. How much was the debt? $40. $40. A sum that felt enormous when you had nothing, and that felt from where Silas stood like a small and solvable problem. "I have $40, he said. She looked at him sharply. "I am not asking you to pay my uncle's debt." "I know you are not asking," he said. "I am offering." "It is a different thing. Silas." She said his name in a way that made it sound like both a thank you and a refusal. "I cannot allow that." He studied her. She was shaking slightly, he noticed, and it was not the cold. It was the aftermath of fear, the body releasing what it had held during those 5 minutes when Harkin had been in the yard. He had an impulse to close the distance between them and put his hand on her shoulder, and he held that impulse carefully. "They will be back," he said, because it was true and she needed to hear it. "Harkin will ride south like I told him, and he will not find anything, and he will come back." "I know," she said. She uncrossed her arms and straightened up, and there it was again, that determination in her spine that he had noticed in the hayloft when she was still asleep, in the set of her shoulders even when she was unconscious and exhausted. "I need to go to Harlow Creek before he comes back. Pearl is not ready." "Pearl was better yesterday," she said. He had to be honest. "She might be ready in 3 or 4 days, he admitted. "She is closer than I thought." "Then 3 or 4 days," she said, "and I will go." He nodded because it was her decision, and he respected that. But his mind was already turning over the problem of Reed Harkin in the way it turned over all problems, looking at it from every angle, weighing options. He did not like any of the options that ended with Ella Talbot riding alone into Harlow Creek with Harkin somewhere on the trails between here and there. That evening at supper he told her the rest of what he was thinking. "I could ride with you to Harlow Creek," he said. "Leave after Pearl is ready. I have supplies I need to get from the trading post anyway." She looked at him across the table. "You do not have to do that." "I know," he said. "Do you want me to?" The question sat between them for a moment, plain and uncomplicated, the way he tried to make things when he said them. She held his gaze and he held hers, and whatever was said in that look took considerably longer than any words would have. "Yes," she said. "I would like that." He nodded once and passed her the bread, and they ate supper, and the lamp burned between them, and outside the wind came down from the high peaks bringing the first real taste of winter. Those 3 days before Pearl was ready were the most vivid days of Silas Colter's recent life. Not because anything dramatic happened in them. Nothing dramatic happened. What happened was smaller than that and more permanent. They talked in a way that made him feel like the walls of the world were expanding around him, pushing back to make room for all the things being said. They worked side by side in the garden and in the barn and around the homestead, and the work felt different with another person in it, felt less like something he did in order to survive and more like something worth doing. She made him laugh twice, which was a thing that did not happen often. Once when she described, in precise and quietly devastating detail, the the chaos of her attempt to reorganize his tack room. And once when she read aloud a passage from Middlemark with such perfect deadpan inflection, on a line that was meant to be read straight, that the comedy of it hit him sideways and he laughed. And she looked pleased with herself in a way that made him want to give her every possible reason to look that way again. He caught himself watching her when she was not watching him. He caught himself noting things. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was reading. The way she held her coffee mug in both hands every morning like it was a small warming fire. The way she said his name, 2 syllables that somehow managed to be both formal and personal at the same time. He was not a man who spent much time on his own interior landscape, but these things were hard to miss. They had a quality of accumulation, each one light in itself, but gathering weight as they stacked up, until the weight of them was something he could feel. He also spent a portion of those 3 days thinking about Reed Harkin, in the hard, practical way he thought about threats. Harkin was not going to find what he was looking for south of the river, and he was going to double back. And when he doubled back, he was going to look harder. The washing on the line had been a risk. Harkin was not a smart man, but he was a persistent one, which was in some ways more dangerous. Silas spent one evening cleaning and loading his rifle and his pistol with the methodical care he gave to any task that mattered, and he positioned them where they could be reached quickly if needed, and he said nothing about this to Ella because she was worried enough, and because worrying about Harkin was his job, not hers. On the 14th morning, Pearl walked a full circuit of the yard without the slightest hesitation in her step, her head high and her gait even, and Silas watched her and felt the satisfaction of a good thing healed, and also, beneath that satisfaction, the feeling of a clock running down. "She is ready," he told Ella at breakfast. Ella set her coffee down. "Today then," she said. "This afternoon," he said. "We will leave after the midday meal. It is an 18-mile ride, and I want to have the sun with us for as long as possible." She nodded. She looked at her coffee. "I have been thinking," she said, and then she stopped. He waited. "I have been thinking about what is in Harlow Creek for me," she said. "I have been turning it over. There will be work, maybe, sewing or housework or cooking for one of the boarding houses. It will be a different kind of small than Ohio was, but it will be small." She looked up. "I have also been thinking about what is here." He was very still. "What have you been thinking about what is here?" "I have been thinking that I am not in a hurry," she said. "I have been thinking that Pearl is ready, and that technically the arrangement we made is complete, but that no one is requiring me to leave today, or necessarily very soon." She met his eyes, and there was nothing evasive or uncertain in her expression, only that clear-eyed honesty that was entirely her own. "Unless you want me to." He looked at her for a moment that felt longer than it was. "I do not want you to," he said. "Then I do not need to," she said. They sat there in the morning light, the two of them at the table with their coffee and the remains of breakfast, and the simplicity of what had just been decided between them was the most enormous thing that had happened in that cabin since Silas had built it. But there was still Harkin, and Silas had not forgotten Harkin for a single day, and Harkin solved the question of timing by arriving the next morning with 3 men. Silas was at the barn. He heard them coming this time before they reached the property, heard the sound of 4 horses moving with purpose down the eastern slope of the trail, and he came out of the barn and called to Ella on the porch in a low, even voice. "Get inside the cabin," he said. "Take the pistol from the table drawer and stay back from the window." She did not ask questions. She went. He stood in the yard with his rifle in the crook of his arm when they rode in. Harkin looked uglier than he had before, in the way that men who are frustrated and used to getting what they want look uglier when that one has been denied. He had brought the lean young one again and 2 additional men, one of them very large in a way that was meant to be intimidating, and the 4 of them spread out slightly when they rode in, the way men do when they are trying to make a show of force. "I went south," Harkin said. "Nothing there." "Told you what I saw," Silas said. "I think you lied to me," Harkin said. Silas considered this. "That is your conclusion to draw," he said. Harkin's eyes went past him to the cabin. "I want to look inside your cabin," he said. "No," Silas said. The word was so flat and so final that it seemed to take Harkin a moment to process it. He was accustomed to men who negotiated or argued or backed down. He was not accustomed to men who said no the way Silas Colter said no, the way a mountain says no, without heat or apology or any suggestion that the position might shift. "There is a woman in there who owes me money," Harkin said. "Any debt her uncle accrued is not hers to pay," Silas said. "That is the law in Wyoming territory. If you went to any judge in the territory and presented your claim, they would tell you the same thing. What you are doing is harassment at best and robbery at worst." "I do not need a judge," Harkin said, and his hand moved toward his holster. He stopped when Silas raised the rifle. It was a smooth motion, unhurried, the way a man moves who has done something so many times it has become part of his body. The rifle was at his shoulder before Harkin's hand had finished its journey, and the way Silas was standing, the way he held it, told everyone in the yard that he had not raised it to threaten. He had raised it because he was prepared to use it. The big man on Harkin's left looked at Silas and then looked at Harkin and made a private calculation. The lean young one had gone very still. Even Harkin's horse felt the shift in the air and moved nervously. "I want you to leave my property," Silas said. "I want you to ride toward Cody and not come back. Whatever George Talbot owed you, he took that debt with him when he died, and there is nothing left of it here. If you come back, I will ride to Harlow Creek and file papers with the marshal, and you will have a lot more to worry about than $40. Harkin stared at him. The red in his face had deepened, but the red was not only anger now. There was something else in it, something that men who do not have courage call calculation, but is actually the recognition that they have met something they cannot move. "You are making an enemy," Harkin said. "I already have enough friends," Silas said. "Leave." They left. The big one first, then the lean young one, then the other two, and Harkin last of all, with his jaw set and his eyes saying things that his good sense prevented his mouth from saying. Silas watched them down the trail until the sound of their horses faded completely, and then he lowered the rifle and stood in the quiet yard with the aspens moving on the hill above, and the chickens resuming their business around his feet as if nothing had happened. The cabin door opened behind him. He turned. Ella stood in the doorway with the pistol in her hand, held correctly, pointed safely at the ground. She had known how to hold it. Found he was not surprised. She looked at the empty trail where Harkin had been, and then she looked at Silas, and her eyes were the most complicated he had ever seen them. "He will not come back," Silas said. "Not to this property. He might file a nuisance complaint in Cody, but it will go nowhere, and men like Harkin do not like official attention. He will move on to simpler problems." "You are very certain," she said. "I know the type," he said. "Bullies need targets that do not push back." I pushed back. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him. The morning was very bright and very still, and somewhere up the hill an aspen leaf let go of its branch and fell in a long, turning spiral of gold. "You were not afraid," she said. "I was a little afraid," he said, which was the truth, "but I was more determined." She crossed the yard to him, and she stopped about an arm's length away and looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and the distance between them felt like the smallest question he had ever been asked. "Silas," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think I am staying," she said. "Not because of Harkin, not because of the mountains, not because of Pearl or the garden or the cabin." She took a breath. "Because of you." He could hear his own heartbeat. He was not a man who was often aware of his heartbeat. "That is the reason I would want you to stay," he said. She reached up and put her hand against his chest, just flat against the front of his coat, and he covered it with his own hand, which was large enough to cover it entirely and then some. They stood like that in the yard while the aspens moved and the light came down the mountain and the morning went on around them, and then he brought her hand up and held it properly, her fingers in his, and that was the beginning. It was not a fast beginning. He was not a fast man, and she was not a woman who hurried toward things she was not certain of, and so what grew between them grew the way good things grow, steadily and with deep roots. But it grew without stopping. Every day there was more of it. Every morning when she was at the stove and he came in from the barn and she handed him his coffee without being asked, because she had already learned how he took it and when he needed it. Every evening when they sat on the porch and she leaned slightly toward him as the night cooled, a degree at a time, and he did not move away. Every time they read together and he reached across the table to turn the page and his hand brushed hers, and neither of them pulled back. He kissed her for the first time 3 weeks after the morning she had been sleeping in his hayloft. They were in the garden in the late afternoon, and she was telling him about a book she had read in Ohio, describing a passage that had moved her, and she was looking up at him while she talked in the particular animated way she had when something pleased her, and he stopped listening to the words and simply looked at her, and she noticed, and she stopped talking and he said, "May I?" in his low, plain voice, and she said yes before he had finished saying it. It was a careful kiss. He was a careful man with the things he valued, but she kissed him back with no carefulness at all, with her hands coming up to his chest and her face tilting up and all of her committed to it the way she was committed to everything, fully and without reservation. When they pulled back she was slightly breathless and he was entirely undone. "Well," she said. "Yes," he agreed. She laughed, and it was the best sound the mountains had ever given him. October came with its cold clarity, the kind of Wyoming October that reminded you it was not playing. The first real frost killed the last of the garden, and they spent a day together pulling what could be salvaged and putting it away for winter, working in silence mostly, the comfortable kind, handing each other tools and moving around each other in the small space of the root cellar like they had been doing it for years. He wrote a letter to the marshal in Harlow Creek about Harkin, keeping it brief and factual, and sending it with a passing rider heading that way. 3 weeks later, a letter came back saying Harkin had indeed attempted to file a claim in Cody, that the judge had dismissed it immediately, and that Harkin had left Cody in the direction of Montana and was unlikely to return. Silas read the letter twice and handed it to Ella without comment, and she read it and put it in the stove, and that was the end of Reed Harkin. He asked her to marry him in November. The mountains had snow on them now down to the tree line, and the aspens had lost their leaves and stood bare and silver against the white, and the world had contracted to the warm circle of the homestead and the cabin and the barn. He asked her in the evening after supper, not with any particular ceremony, because he was not a ceremonious man, but with the full weight of what he meant behind it. He said, "I would like you to stay here, not as a guest and not as an arrangement, but as my wife, if that is something you want." She looked at him steadily and said, "It is something I have wanted for a while." "Good," he said. "I was hoping so." "You were hoping so," she repeated, and the gentle amusement in her voice was the most affectionate thing he had ever heard. They rode to Harlow Creek in December to be married, the two of them on horseback through the snow, Pearl recovered and strong and happy to be moving with a purpose. Harlow Creek was a modest town with a main street of wooden storefronts and a population of about 300 people, including a circuit judge who married them in the small wood-frame courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon with 2 of the courthouse clerks as witnesses. Ella wore her best dress, which was a deep green wool she had made herself during the weeks at the cabin using fabric Silas had brought back from the trading post, specifically because the green of it reminded him of her eyes. He wore his good coat and had trimmed his hair, not all of it, just enough to be respectable, and she had told him that morning when she saw him that he looked very fine, and the way she said it had made him want to stand taller just to be what she was seeing. The judge who married them was a heavy-set man with spectacles, and an air of having performed this ceremony so many times that he could do it in his sleep, but he said the words clearly, and with enough weight that they meant something, and Silas said his part in a steady voice, and looked at Ella the whole time he was saying it, and she said her part looking straight back at him, and when it was done the 2 witnesses applauded, and the judge shook Silas's hand and told Ella that she had married a man worth keeping. "I know it," she said, and she was looking at Silas when she said it. They stayed in Harlow Creek for 2 nights at the boarding house before riding back up the mountain. Ella talked to every person she met in those 2 days with her characteristic open attention, and Silas watched the town respond to her and felt the particular pride of a man who is new to pride, the pride of being the person who gets to walk beside her. The winter was long and cold, and magnificent in the way that Wyoming winters are magnificent, which is to say absolutely uncompromisingly. The snow came in earnest in January and buried the yard to the top of the fence posts and made the morning barn work a matter of digging tunnels to the animals, and the cabin was the only warm thing for miles. They were inside together more than they had been, which Silas had thought might prove difficult, 2 people in a small space through the long winter months, but it did not prove difficult at all. It proved to be the best thing he had known. She was teaching herself to read his field guide to North American birds by watching from the cabin window during the daylight hours and matching what she saw to the descriptions. She reported her sightings to him each evening with the quiet excitement of someone who is discovering that the world is endlessly interesting up close. A pine grosbeak, red as a coal, sitting on the fence post. A pair of Clark's nutcrackers arguing over something in the snow. A great gray owl sitting in the tall pine at the edge of the yard like a ghost that had decided to become visible. He was working on an extension to the cabin. He had been meaning to build it for 2 years and had never had sufficient motivation. And now he had motivation and a clear vision of what the finished space should look like. He worked on it on the warmer days, cutting and fitting timber with the satisfaction of a man who builds because he loves building. And Ella brought him coffee and held boards while he nailed them, and asked intelligent questions about how things fit together, and it felt like the most ordinary and extraordinary thing in the world. In February she told him she was expecting their child. She told him quietly, early in the morning before the lamp was fully lit, sitting across from him at the breakfast table with her hands around her coffee in the way she always held it, her eyes clear and direct on his. He absorbed it. He was quiet for a moment because he needed a moment, and then he reached across the table and covered her hands with his. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "A little sick in the mornings." "Nothing dramatic." He looked at her face in the early morning dimness and thought about the 11 years he had spent in this cabin alone and the September morning he had climbed a hayloft ladder and found her sleeping in the hay. And the distance between those 2 points seemed both very long and very short at the same time, the way great distances look from a mountain, where you can see from here to there in a single glance. "Good," he said. His voice was lower than usual. "That is very good." She turned her hands over beneath his and held his fingers. "You are going to be wonderful at this," she said. "I hope so," he said. "I know so," she said. Spring came back to the mountains in April, reluctant and muddy, and then all at once magnificent, the way Wyoming spring always came, as if it had been planning something all winter and finally got impatient. The creek ran fast and cold with snowmelt, and the first wildflowers came up in the wet meadow below the cabin, and the aspens leafed out in a yellow-green so vivid it looked painted. Ella moved through the spring with the contained energy of someone who has a great deal going on internally and is managing it beautifully. She finished the garden in May, expanded it by a third, and organized it with a system that made considerably more sense than the system Silas had used for the past decade. He told her this and she said, "Well, 11 years was a long time to be doing it without input." He finished the cabin extension in June, 3 weeks before the baby was due. It was a proper bedroom, warm and solid, with 2 windows facing south to catch the light, and a good wood floor that he had sanded smooth, and space for a proper bed with a real mattress that they ordered from Harlow Creek and that arrived on the back of a freight wagon, along with a rocking chair that Ella had found in the Trading Post's catalog and wanted so fiercely that he had ordered it before she finished describing it. Their son was born on the 22nd of July, 1879, in the middle of the morning, with the mountain light coming through those south-facing windows in broad gold sheets, and a midwife named Mrs. Addie Hatch, who lived 8 miles down the trail and had delivered half the babies in the territory, attending. He was born healthy and large, which surprised no one considering his father, and he entered the world with a voice that suggested he had strong opinions about it. Silas held him with the careful precision he brought to everything fragile and of value, and the child looked up at him with the unfocused, ancient gaze of the newborn, and Silas felt something rearrange itself in him in a way that did not have a name in English or any other language he knew. "What shall we call him?" Ella asked. She was pale and tired and more beautiful than she had ever looked, which was a thing he did not know how to say, so he tried to put it in how he was looking at her. "I thought Thomas," he said. "For your father." She blinked and her eyes went bright. "Yes," she said, "Thomas Colter. A good name for a Wyoming boy." Thomas was as decisive about his appetites and opinions as his mother, and as patient about everything else as his father, which Ella said was a very practical combination, and Silas agreed. He grew in the way of mountain children, steadily and with no wasted motion, taking in the world around him with large green eyes that he had got from his mother and a set to his jaw that was unmistakably his father's. Silas taught him things the way Silas did everything, without hurry, starting when Thomas was old enough to pay attention. How to read the sky, how to handle an animal gently, how to be useful and how to rest, and when each was appropriate. Ella taught him to read, starting before he was 3, and by 4 he was sounding out words from the Bird Field Guide with a seriousness that made both his parents hide their smiles. The homestead expanded. Silas built a second animal shelter in the fall of 1880 and acquired 2 more horses, and they expanded the garden again and started selling surplus vegetables to a neighboring ranch family, the Lindqvists, who had more land but less garden sense. The Lindqvists had a daughter a year older than Thomas, and the 2 children played together on the days their families exchanged visits, solemn little companions in the yard, and Ella and Ingrid Lindqvist became friends of the kind that make mountain winters shorter and mountain springs more welcome. In the spring of 1881, Ella told him she was expecting again, and this time she told him in the garden on a May afternoon with Thomas asleep inside, and the birds going through their evening business in the pines, and Silas set down the shovel he was holding and pulled her against him and held her there in the garden for a long time, her head tucked under his chin and his arms around her, while the mountains stood around them all in their permanent, indifferent, magnificent patience. "2," he said. "2," she agreed, her voice warm against his chest. Their second child was a daughter, born in December of 1881, in a snowstorm so vigorous that Silas had to ride to fetch Mrs. Hatch in the dark and return through knee-deep drifts with the midwife bundled behind him on Pearl, who was 7 years old now, and as reliable as the mountain itself. The daughter arrived before the storm broke, and after, when the sky cleared at midnight and the stars came out in their full winter quantity, the cabin was warm and full of the sounds of a new person finding her voice. They named her Clara, for no one in particular except that it was a good name that suited her face. Thomas was 2.5, and met his sister with the solemn gravity of a senior official receiving a junior one. He looked at her for a long time in Ella's arms and then announced, "Small," and went back to his blocks, which was more or less what everyone expected. The cabin with its extension was full now in the way good homes are full, not crowded but occupied, every corner belonging to someone's life. Silas moved through it in the mornings doing what he had always done, building the fire, pulling his boots on, going to the barn. And the difference from the man who had done these same things 11 years ago alone was not in the motions but in the gravity beneath them, in what all of it was for. He stood at the barn door in the early morning sometimes, as he had always done, and watched the light come down the mountain, and now Ella came to stand beside him occasionally, her shoulder at the level of his arm, and they watched it together. The mountains did not care who was watching them. They were as large and as indifferent and as magnificent as they had always been, but they looked different with her beside him. They looked like something shared rather than something endured. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked him one such morning in the autumn of 1882, when Clara was almost a year old and Thomas was approaching 4 and the homestead was well into its 3rd year of being theirs instead of just his. The solitude, he thought about it properly, the way he thought about things she asked, without dismissing the question. "Sometimes I miss the quiet," he said, "but silence is different from solitude. We have silence in the mornings before the children wake. We have it in the evenings. I have more of it than I need. And the solitude itself," he looked at the mountains. "No," he said, "I do not miss it. I did not know I was missing anything until you were here, and once I knew there was nothing to miss." She leaned against his arm, and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the barn doorway watching the light come down the Absaroka Mountains in the particular way it came on September mornings, painting everything gold and making the aspens look like they were lit from inside, which they almost were, the way the best things in the world are lit, from somewhere deep and permanent and not easily explained. In the years that followed, the story of the homestead was the story of its steady becoming. Thomas started formal lessons at 4, conducted by Ella at the kitchen table with the same books that had lined the cabin shelf from the beginning, and he proved to be an ardent reader who would have been difficult to stop even if anyone had wanted to. He read the bird guide through twice before he was 5 and started keeping his own list of sightings in a small journal. Silas brought him from Harlow Creek, and he reported his observations to his father each evening, with the precision of a scientist who has not yet been told that precision is unusual. Clara was a different kind of child entirely, which Ella said privately to Silas was the universe's way of preventing boredom. Where Thomas was still and observant, Clara was in motion, always climbing something or following Silas to the barn, or dragging a bucket larger than herself across the yard, with no clear destination in mind but great confidence in the journey. She spoke early and clearly and constantly, and she had an opinion about everything before she had the vocabulary to fully express it, which led to a period of intense frustration around 18 months that required considerable patience from everyone in the household, and that passed as suddenly as a spring storm. Pearl died in the spring of 1884, which was hard. She was 13 years old and she went peacefully in her sleep in the barn, the way good animals go, without suffering. Silas found her in the morning and he sat with her for a while before he told Ella. And when he told Ella, she came to the barn and sat with him there in the hay, which was the right thing to do, and the thing she knew to do without being asked. Thomas, who was 4.5, cried with the complete and dignified grief of a child who has not yet learned to perform grief or hide it, and then helped dig the hole for Pearl in the meadow below the cabin, and then put a stone on the place and drew a horse on the stone with a piece of chalk, which stayed through 3 summers before the weather took it. Life in the Wyoming Territory in the 1880s was not without its complications. The cattle wars that were brewing in the southern part of the territory sent ripples north, and there were seasons when the question of who had the right to the range and the water was a tension in every conversation in Harlow Creek, every gathering of ranchers and homesteaders. Silas went to the town meetings and listened and spoke when he had something worth saying, which was not every meeting but often enough that people listened when he did. He was known by then as a fair man with good judgment and no particular allegiance, except to what was plainly right, which made him useful in situations where those qualities were rarer than they ought to have been. Ella went to the meetings too, which was not universal among the wives, and she had opinions and expressed them, and the initial surprise this caused among some of the men was eventually replaced by the recognition that her opinions were worth hearing, which she had expected to take longer than it did and was accordingly pleased about. She started a small school in 1885, holding it twice a week in the Lindqvist's barn, which was larger than the cabin and could accommodate the 7 children of the surrounding homesteads. It was not formal, no slate boards or strict curriculum, just Ella with books and questions and the particular gift she had for making learning feel like opening doors rather than filling containers. By the time Clara was old enough to attend, there were 11 children coming twice a week, and Ingrid Lindqvist had begun helping teach the youngest ones, and there was a genuine conversation underway in Harlow Creek about building a proper schoolhouse. The schoolhouse was built in 1887. Silas helped build it, along with 6 other men, and it took 3 weekends of hard work and produced a solid timber building with 2 windows and a real stove and 30 desks that a carpenter in Harlow Creek made and delivered in a wagon. Ella became the town's first proper teacher, paid a salary that was modest but real, and she rode the 8 miles to Harlow Creek and back 3 days a week on a steady gray horse named October that Silas had acquired and trained with her specifically in mind. Thomas started school in Harlow Creek at 6, and the teacher there, a young man named Mr. Forsyth, who had come from Boston and was still finding his footing in Wyoming, told Ella and Silas at the end of Thomas's first month that their son read better than the 12-year-olds in his class and that he was going to need challenges to stay interested. This was not news to his parents, but they appreciated the confirmation. A third child arrived in the fall of 1887, another boy, which Thomas received with measured enthusiasm, and Clara received by attempting to immediately teach him to walk, a project that proved optimistic for another 11 months. They named him Arthur, and he had Silas's dark hair and Ella's green eyes in a combination that was startlingly beautiful, and he turned out to be the most social of the 3 children, the one who wanted to know everyone and be in the middle of everything, which kept his parents alert. Silas was 40 years old in 1887, and he was not the kind of man who thought much about age, but he thought about it that year in the way of a man who has reason to take inventory. His body was as strong as it had ever been, built by years of physical work that had not let up and that he did not expect to let up, and the gray that was coming into his dark hair had come in only at the temples so far, which Ella told him looked distinguished, saying it in a tone that made clear she was sincere, and that sincerity sat in him warmly. He had a wife he loved more each year in the specific way of a man who pays attention, with an accumulation of detail and knowledge, and the ongoing astonishment of being fully known and fully chosen. He had 3 healthy children who were becoming themselves with the same vigor the aspens showed every spring, each one entirely distinct, each one carrying something of him and something of Ella, and a great deal that was entirely their own. He had a homestead that was whole and good and producing, and that bore his hands everywhere, in the walls and the floors and the fences and the root cellar and the barns and the garden, and the trail that led up through the aspens to the high meadow, where he still went sometimes in the early morning when the rest of the household was sleeping, and the mountain was at its largest and most quiet. One such morning in October of 1887, he was sitting in the high meadow before dawn, watching the eastern sky begin its slow work of producing light, when he heard footsteps on the trail behind him. Quiet footsteps, careful ones, but not quiet enough to fool him. He smiled before he turned around. Ella came through the last of the aspens and stopped at the edge of the meadow with her coat pulled tight and her breath clouding in the cold air and her hair still loose the way she wore it in the mornings before she put it up, and she looked at him sitting on the rock where he always sat, and he looked at her standing at the meadow's edge, and they both understood the moment for what it was without having to name it. "I woke and you were not there," she said. "I did not want to wake you," he said. "You needed the sleep." "I needed to know where you were more," she said, and she came across the meadow and sat down beside him on the rock, close enough that her shoulder was against his arm, and he put his arm around her, and she settled against him, and they watched the dawn come to the Absaroka Mountains together. The sky went from black to deep blue, and then to the color that has no name, the color that exists only for the 15 minutes before sunrise when the light is coming but has not yet arrived. And then the first edge of the sun found the highest peak and sent its first ray down the mountain's face like a hand reaching. The aspens around the meadow caught the light and held it in their yellow leaves, and the frost on the grass lit up silver, and the whole world was briefly, perfectly made of light. "I think about that morning sometimes," Ella said. Her voice was quiet in the stillness. "Which morning?" "The morning you brought breakfast to the hayloft," she said, without asking me a single question. "I woke up and there was food and coffee and a blanket, and I did not know who had left them, and I was afraid for a moment, and then I was not afraid because it did not feel like a trap. It felt like kindness." "It was kindness," he said. "I know," she said. "I know that now, but I did not know it then." I had been walking alone in the mountains for 2 days, and I was frightened and exhausted, and I did not trust anything, and then there was breakfast. She paused. It was the first moment in a very long time that someone had done something for me simply because they could. He was quiet for a moment, watching the light work its way down the mountain. "I did not know what you needed," he said. "I knew you needed food and rest. I did not want to ask you questions before you had both of those things." "That was exactly right," she said. "That is exactly what I needed." She looked up at him. "You are always exactly right about what a person needs." "Not always," he said. "Often enough," she said. "Often enough to count." He looked down at her face in the early light, the green of her eyes catching it, the particular expression she wore when she was fully in a moment and not anywhere else. In 9 years he had not found the bottom of her. She was as interesting at 33 as she had been at 24, which he had been told was not guaranteed and which he treated as the gift it was. "I was afraid too," he said. She looked up at him. "Of what?" "When I found you sleeping there," he said. "Not of you. Of what I felt when I saw you. I thought this is going to matter, and that was frightening because I had arranged my life very carefully to not have things that mattered in that way." "And then," she said, "and then I made breakfast," he said, "because there was nothing else sensible to do." She laughed softly against his shoulder, and he felt the laugh as much as he heard it. "Nothing else sensible to do," she repeated. "Silas Colter, that is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me." "I am not a romantic man," he said. "No," she agreed. "You are not a romantic man. You are better than a romantic man. You are a true man, and that is rarer and worth considerably more." The sun cleared the ridge fully, and the meadow went from cool and silver to gold and warm all at once, the way sunrise always happened here, suddenly and completely. And they sat in it together on the rock where he always sat, with the mountains around them and the homestead down the slope and the children still sleeping in the warm cabin, and the aspens letting their last leaves go one by one in the light morning wind. He held her, and she held him, and the mountains held them both. In the years after 1887, the homestead continued to be what it had always been under their hands, something solid and growing and alive. Thomas grew into a serious young man with his father's patience and his mother's intellect, and at 16, he expressed a desire to go to university in the East, which both Ella and Silas supported fully, though the saving for it required 3 years of careful management. Clara grew into a strong and decisive young woman who had, by 12, formed clear opinions about what she was going to do with her life, which included working with animals, specifically horses, and who could already shoe a horse at 13 under her father's instruction. Arthur remained the family's ambassador to the wider world, knowing everyone in Harlow Creek by name and being known by everyone in return, and at 10, already possessed the social intelligence that made people feel good in his company without quite knowing why. Ella's school in Harlow Creek grew into a proper institution by 1890, with 2 rooms and a second teacher, a young woman named Miss Vance who had trained in Colorado and who quickly became both a good teacher and a friend to Ella. The valley around Harlow Creek was changing in the way the whole territory was changing, filling in, becoming less wild and more settled, and Ella understood that the school was part of what decided what a place became, what kind of thinking it produced and sustained. Silas added a second barn in 1889 and a root cellar beneath the first barn's floor in 1890, and the homestead had by then the permanent quality of something that would outlast the people in it, which was how he had always thought a good homestead should feel. He was not a sentimental man, but he had a sentiment about the aspens. Every September when their leaves turned, he spent a morning watching them from the yard, and he thought about the morning in September of 1878 when the aspens had been just beginning to turn, and his whole life had been about to change in a hayloft he did not yet know needed watching. He thought about what he had told Ella once, that the aspens shared their roots underground, that what looked like separate trees was often one organism connected where you could not see. He thought that was still the most accurate description of what had happened between him and Ella Talbot, who was now Ella Colter, who was now as much a part of this mountain and this homestead and this life as the aspens themselves. One autumn evening in 1892, with Thomas 14 and away at school in Cheyenne, Clara 13, and spending the afternoon with the Lindqvists' horses, and Arthur 11 and somewhere in the vicinity of the creek catching things he would report on at supper, Ella and Silas sat on the porch in the late light the way they had always sat on the porch, and the mountain stood around them in the particular gold and blue of September evenings, and there was not a single thing undone between them. "Do you remember what you said to me the first morning?" she asked. She was drinking tea now in the evenings instead of coffee, a shift she had made some time in the past year, and she held the cup in both hands the way she had always held the coffee mug, as if warmth were something to be held onto. "I said good morning," he said, "and then I said you did not owe me an explanation." "You said the barn was there for shelter," she said. "That is what it is for." "It is what it is for," he agreed. She looked at him sidelong, her eyes in the evening light the color they had always been, dark and complicated and full of everything she was. "That is also what you are for," she said quietly. "Is it not? Shelter." He looked at her, this woman who had slept in his hayloft on a September morning 14 years ago, and changed the entire shape of his life without either of them knowing that was what was happening. He thought about the word shelter, what it meant. What it actually meant to a man who had built his own walls against the mountain winters for 11 years before she came. He thought about what it meant to shelter and to be sheltered, to give and to receive the same gift, to be so thoroughly known by another person that their presence became a kind of home you could carry anywhere the mountain sent you. "Yes," he said, "that is what I am for." She leaned toward him and he put his arm around her, and she settled against him with the ease of something long established and still chosen every day. And the sun finished its work on the mountains, and the first star came out above the western peak, and the aspens on the hill above the cabin moved in the evening wind, all of them connected beneath the ground in ways no one could see, turning gold from inside. They stayed on the porch until the cold drove them in, which took longer than it should have, because neither of them was in a hurry, and the mountain was patient with them, the way the best things always are. Inside, the stove was warm and the lamp was lit, and there were 3 plates to set for supper, and one set put aside for Arthur when he came in from the creek, which he would, muddy and enthusiastic, and full of things to report. The cabin smelled of the soup Ella had left simmering since midday and the wood smoke, and the particular clean cold scent of September air that had been tracked in on boots and coats all day. The shelf of books stood in its corner, Middlemark among them, well-worn and familiar, its spine soft from many hands. The rocking chair Silas had ordered from the catalog in 1879 was in the corner where it had always been, still in good condition, because Silas Colter built and bought things to last. It was an ordinary evening in a long succession of ordinary evenings that were not ordinary at all. It was a life. A full one, made from the unexpected thing that had happened when a mountain man climbed a hayloft ladder on a September morning and found a woman sleeping in his hay, and had the sense and the grace to let her sleep, and bring her breakfast and ask no questions, and wait for the rest of it to unfold in its own time, which it had. which it continued to do in all the ways that matter for all the years that followed.